Hey folks, this one's been coming for quite a while. I've been thinking about it and I haven't really put up any pre-recordeds in a minute. I guess I've been paneling as of late. People have caught me, but not on my own channel, which is kind of odd since everybody used to come to me. Anyway, there's a subject that's been on my mind for maybe the past couple of weeks, and it's, of course, it has to do with COVID-19, as everything does. And the ramifications, not only here but worldwide, but we're going to focus on the United States for right now. And we're going to focus on the Black community. And of course, since it's the manosphere, it's going to be about dating and mating. And as you can see in the title, and probably the appropriate thumbnail, is a cup of coffee. Now, why is a Starbucks cup of coffee so significant in this particular video? And if you've heard me drop this on other people's panels or even one of my live streams, it's not the cup of coffee, it's the price of a cup of coffee. And for those that have been waiting, I'm going to go ahead and drop the line here. I say within 6 months or so, give or take, as far as having sex with a woman, well, most women in the Black community, probably in all communities, it'll be cheaper to actually buy her or pay her for sex than it would be to buy her that cup of Starbucks coffee. That's just an opinion. It could not come about, but if things keep trending the way they're trending, I don't see any other outcome. And let me briefly explain why, because I know that's a bold stance to take. It's a bold statement to actually make, that it'll be cheaper to pay her for sex than buy her a cup of Starbucks coffee. And it probably wouldn't make sense. It probably would be outrageous. Of course it wouldn't be. Sex is expensive, and normally it is. Under normal circumstances, normal conditions, sex is extremely expensive. A lot of time and resources have to be put into it, which in this sector that a lot of guys are doing or have formerly done. Learn game, improve yourself, spend a bunch of money, get your money up, all kinds of stuff to qualify yourself for the golden vagina. It is because the perception is that the supply is finite and rare, and that's just a perception. That's a perception in a system that restricts it, because it's neither finite in the ordinary sense or rare. In fact, there's more vaginas than there are penises. So that would make it an oversupply. But under the system, and rightfully so, to keep a society running properly, you have to restrict the access. You have to make the commodity rare. You have to make the commodity expensive and restrict the supply so that the society can run properly. You don't have babies and diseases running around willy-nilly. So let's get right into the why. And stick with me. It may or may not make sense to you. I'm going to get some pushback, but let me give you my reasoning. If you look at Greece and what they went through when they went through their economic implosion, and I've posted the article about Greece and the prostitutes and the diesels, how it affected their society, and it reminded me of the crack era that I came of age in the early 80s to the early 90s. And in a microcosm, the same thing happened. Whereas one day the price, and this is $1980, $1970, which is probably double or triple the amounts in $2020. So when I came of age, the price of a prostitute was like $35, right? So there would be like $100 in $2020, just as a ballpark figure. But 4 years later, the price of sex was at $5. It had dropped like 75% or 80% of its market value in just 3 years. Because what? Because the crack era put a lot of women on the streets. It put a lot more supply into the market. So if you go by the laws of supply and demand, as supply goes up, the demand goes down, the prices get cheaper. I remember in 1998 when I was at Comdex, and a 50-inch plasma TV, which is what the flat screens were back then, was like $35,000 to $50,000. $35,000 to $50,000 in 1998, because the supply was limited. It's very expensive to make. Very few of them were out there, so the supply was limited and the price was extremely high. Most people couldn't afford a flat screen TV. 2020, fast forward 20 years, you can buy the same TV, a better TV, at Walmart during Black Friday for $250. Not saying the same thing, but that shows you the laws of supply and demand at work. When you make something a commodity, you commoditize something, and then you get an oversupply of something, and you dump it on the market, the price will plummet. Now it's cheaper to replace a big screen TV rather than fix it. Doesn't work, throw it out, go get you another one. I see the same thing coming with women because of COVID-19. For the past 30 years, maybe even 40 years, say 40 years, 1980 to 2020, 40 years, because of the environment, the relative first world environment, the relative wealth that this country has had, the relative generous benefits that the government has put upon the society, especially the women. Women didn't need their men. There was a separation. So women didn't need to supply sex into the system because they didn't have to. So they could demand a higher price or higher premium on their company, their sex, their relationships, which in some senses that's true, some senses that's bad, because not true, because women do need companionship and sex and all that kind of stuff. So there was a quasi balance, okay? But the thing is, relatively, the price of relationship and sex was kept relatively high. So it did kind of restrict the supply, even by giving women freedom. Even though they were actually giving up more sex, they could still demand more for their sexual services, for their relationship services, for their emotional services. They could actually keep the supply off the market. Just like in Greece, they could keep the supply off the market. But what happens when the economic system can no longer support women that are no longer needed to work, no longer needed for wives, no longer needed for the things that they supplied? What do they have left? They have sex. They have their bodies. And so now, previously the supply was limited because there's very few women actually going into that service. All of a sudden you're flooding the market. And even in Greece, which is a relatively conservative country, believe it or not, patriarchal, very relatively conservative, where the price of a woman went from $150 all the way down to $10. And it's documented because I actually read the article. Because you dumped a lot of women onto the street or onto the market where they were desperate enough to actually use what they had left, which is their most valuable piece, which is their vaginas. But you dump so much of the supply onto the market that it becomes what? Either less or sometimes nearly worthless. Oversupply, supply and demand. There's never been more than, at its height, there's never been more than 1 million prostitutes in the United States. And that sounds like a lot. It sounds like a lot of prostitutes, sex workers, because they count all of them as far as sex workers. There's never been more than 1 million. And 1 million sounds like a lot until you balance it against 160, 170 million women in the country. When you balance it out, there's 160 million probably adult women in the country. 1 million is less than 1%. What happens when COVID-19's economic impact really hits, like renters, where people are getting evicted, can't pay their rent. You have 30, 40 million women that can't work, don't have jobs. And the unemployment is running out or diminishing. Women that have houses and can't pay their mortgage. can't feed their kids, have temp jobs and can barely make it, the ones that can find a job. What happens when you dump all these women onto the market? Not just the sex worker market, which is actually growing rapidly. Look at OnlyFans. Look at the street prostitutes, and this is during COVID. Most of your dating sites, you have women actually selling themselves on dating sites. And it's just getting started. What happens when you dump, instead of having 0.5% or less than 1% of the women involved in this kind of behavior, to like 5? It's 10 times the number. And the more likelihood it's going to be between 10 and 20%. What happens if 20% of women actually started engaging in this kind of behavior? That's something that's never happened in this country. 1/5 of your women are actually offering this stuff. What's going to happen to the demand? Demand is going to go down because the supply is going to go way, way, way up. And if supply goes way, way up and the demand goes down because there's only so many guys that can actually afford to participate, price is going to plummet. And normally I don't make a statement about the cup of coffee or the price of sex or price of a woman and saying it'll be cheaper to buy her than get a cup of coffee. And people will say that can never happen, except for what? I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in my lifetime. And I see the effects that it had on the society, on the black community. What happens when it's throughout the whole society, not just a small black community or the black community itself? You know what it did. You know what it did to our women. What's getting ready to happen to the whole country of women, what happens to everybody across the board. White, black, Latino, Asian, across the board. That's what black women aren't looking at. It's not just them this time. I've seen it happen. That's why I believe that it's probably going to happen sooner than later. And it's not something that I take pride in saying, beat my chest out and say, I told you so. Because yeah, guys are gonna enjoy the bounty of all this sexual attention, but it's going to come with a price. It's going to come with a price of your economy going down into the gutter. The price of seeing women and children on the street. That's something black men weren't ready for back then in the 80s. I don't think they're ready for it now. But as a last tidbit, and I'm going to leave you with this. You don't believe that the law of supply and demand can actually work in real life and something cannot plunge in a rapid succession, like overnight? Beginning of this year, before China locked down, price of oil was relatively high, $70 a barrel, $75 a barrel. China locks down 3 months later, the price of oil plummeted per barrel to minus $34. From 75 to minus $34, just plummeted. In a world that runs on energy, that runs on oil. Within 3 months, the price of oil plummeted it $100 because of an oversupply. There were tankers sitting out on the coast because there wasn't enough places to store the oil. Russia and Saudi Arabia had to cut back oil production because the supply was too much. It was driving the price down, which the price has never gotten back to where it was. That's what's going to happen. That's what can happen. And women, as a warning, need to get your shit together. You need to find other skills other than what you've been parading around, which is sex. Because if you don't, you'll become a commodity. When you become a commodity, then you're subject to the forces of supply and demand. And you don't want to be subject to the forces of supply and demand in this market, in this environment. I've seen this before. I would like not to see it again, but I fear that it's going to happen. That's why I tell guys, in 6 months, it may be cheaper to buy her than to date her. Be cheaper to buy her and pay her to sleep with you than buy her a cup of coffee. Harsh words. Let's pray that it doesn't come true. With that, I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one.